Good evening and welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Sawsville. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. For 40 years, Vermont Coverts has been dedicated to empowering landowners and others with the knowledge and the tools and the community support to manage their woodlands for the enhancement of wildlife habitat. Through hands-on trainings like our Coverts Cooperator training, educational workshops like this one, and our peer-to-peer outreach, we help ensure that forests and wildlife habitats remain healthy and resilient. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. And if you enjoy our programs and would like to support our mission, please consider making a donation. And you can do that online at www.vtcoverts.org. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. Please mute yourselves to minimize background noise. You can keep your cameras on or turn them off. It's really up to you, whatever makes you feel most comfortable. We definitely encourage questions. Please type those in the chat, and we have Dana online who may be able to answer them in real time, and we'll also take questions at the end. And to start, we'd love to know who's here, and just type your name and where you're from into the chat. So let's talk about tonight. Tonight's speaker is Kevin Tolan. He's a biologist with the Vermont Center for Ecostudies. He works on both the Vernal Pool Monitoring Program and the Northeast Grassland Ambassadors Program. Both of these programs involve working with volunteers and they want to become involved stewards of these ecosystems, which is very Coverts-like and right in with our mission and our peer-to-peer outreach. Tonight, he's going to be sharing his expertise on vernal pools, what they are, why they matter, and how you can help conserve them. Kevin, thanks for joining us. Go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I see a couple of familiar names here, which is nice, and a couple new names, which is also fantastic. So thanks for spending a bit of time with us on this beautiful evening. Just a bit of background for Vermont Center for Ecostudies. We're a nonprofit headquartered on the Norwich White River Junction line. We do a lot with birds and insects, so mostly things that fly, migratory birds, loons, butterflies and bees. But of course, vernal pools have also become an extremely important part of our work as well. Vernal pools, for reasons we'll discuss, have been very underrepresented in conservation for a long time and kind of disregarded as just mud pits. But as I'll explain, that could not be further from the case. And I think we're really seeing the tide shift in how people approach and appreciate vernal pools, and how much they understand the true value that they hold. So just to kick it off, what is a vernal pool? So vernal means spring and pool means pool. In general, these are areas of forest that during spring snowmelt and rains will flood with water. And then usually come summertime, late summer, a couple months after they flood, they'll dry out. I will note that not all vernal pools dry out every year, but the most important thing is that they have no fish. That's really the key thing that makes a vernal pool from like the wildlife perspective. If they have some type of seasonal wet dry cycle, so they flood in the summer and they dry, or they flood in the spring and dry in the summer, so that means they don't have a permanent spring or a permanent inflow from a stream. It's going to be kind of hard for fish to get established there. And fish are massive egg predators for the amphibians that breed in these sites. So by virtue of them being these temporary wetlands in the middle of a forest, they're pretty much predator free. So they become these fantastic nurseries for species that are only above ground for 5% of their life. We're kind of getting past this point, but a vernal pool in the winter kind of blends in a bit to the forest. Only when the snow is melted a bit can you kind of see the slush on the surface. But a lot of times, depending on the site, sometimes in the year, they will reflood in the fall, and then they'll freeze over and they'll still host and hold water during the off season. This time of year, with everything melting, we're starting to have the pools form. The one on the left is in Weybridge, and this is about like a lowland type of pool, just areas in the woods that are fairly low. The one on the right is like a crack in the bedrock almost. So a bit of a saddle where the water can accumulate and it can't go anywhere because it's bedrock and there's no outflow. So kind of depending on where you are, lowlands and flat versus more hilly and rocky, you'll have vernal pools, but they might look a little bit different. And then in a couple months, they'll dry out after all or most of the amphibian larvae have gotten out and become terrestrial. So when you go out in the summer and the fall, sometimes you only see leafy depression where there's no more water. And this is part of the reason why they're so overlooked. Because if you're not out there during the right time of year when water is present, you might completely overlook this and be like, oh, this is a perfect place to put a house. It's nice and flat. And it's just so easy to build over. The temporary nature of these wetlands just makes them so hard to conserve. But when we get to like the importance of why we need them, though, I try and explain it that they're kind of like a coral reef in the forest. Coral reefs are small and they're extremely important for fish to breed. And you go out to the open ocean and it's kind of like a desert. There really aren't a whole ton of fish out in the desert compared to the coral reef. And it's kind of similar to a vernal pool. Vernal pools have algae growing and they have organisms eating the algae and bringing it to the terrestrial environment. So it's a seed for a lot of amphibians and insects that then bring nutrients across the landscape. And similarly to a coral reef, when it's lost, it can't be easily made up because its output compared to its size is just so astronomically large. So I think the first thing we think of vernal pools and why we need them is the habitat. That's kind of where I've been focused for this intro and probably will be focused for a lot of the rest of the talk. But habitat for the amphibians that breed there, for waterfowl that use it, for moose and deer and bears that drink from it, just becomes extremely valuable having a source of fresh water in the middle of a dry forest. Kind of covers it. These are some nice photos from game cameras that shows a boreal owl or a barred owl and a red-tailed hawk. Birds are actually huge predators in vernal pools. Broadwing hawks seem to really time their northward migration with vernal pools and the emergence of amphibians. So we see a lot of barred owls, especially around vernal pools, and some other hawks and stuff as well. Another reason why vernal pools are really important is because they can act as stepping stones for amphibians and other wildlife between larger wetlands. So you might have a large permanent wetland here and a large permanent pond here, and say I am a bullfrog, where I need to get from point A to point B. Without vernal pools, that's way too far of a journey to make in general. But if you have vernal pools, you can do stepping stones. So you have like one rainy night, go a bit of a distance, another rainy night, go a little bit more of a distance. And it helps connect the different islands of, islands of water on a terrestrial landscape to make sure that gene flow and stuff can be connected. Now, more and more, we're also thinking a lot about flooding. Vernal pools and other wetlands help to reduce runoff and help to buffer flooding downstream by providing an area where water can settle instead of just going right down to the nearest river. And when you lose one vernal pool, they're small, so it's not the most, it's not the end of the world compared to losing a class 1 wetland. The issue is when you lose 100 vernal pools, death by 1,000 paper cuts, because you're losing these individually small, important systems. When you're losing 100 of them, that's where you start seeing really drastic downstream effects. And then finally, nutrient cycling, like I kind of mentioned. I think that terrestrially, algae is not, you can't find algae to eat in terrestrial environments. And so when you have a body of water that can take the sun, put it to algae, the energy from the sun, algae, all these amphibians can eat the algae and then they disperse across the landscape. So they're really helping take the sun's energy and bring it back into the terrestrial biome, which is not something that really occurs in wooded areas without these vernal pools. Not working there. So again, depending where you are, your amphibians might already be above ground, but our amphibians for vernal pools over winter underground on the landscape. Some of the frogs we have, like wood frogs, which I'll discuss in a second, and spring peepers, nest right in the frost line. So like nights such as recent ones where it's been wet and somewhat warm, the water gets right down to these guys. They can come right up above right up to the surface and head right to the pool. Our salamanders tend to overwinter in rodent burrows or along roots below the frost line. So they're a little bit slower to get to the surface than our frogs, but they are, especially the Jefferson and blue spotted salamander, tend to be a little bit earlier than some of the other species. Once they become above ground, they have to get to their vernal pool. And I just want to quickly mention the impact of road crossings on some of our species. When you have a vernal pool here and then you build a road and all these amphibians have to cross it, that is really opening them up to mortality that they wouldn't have experienced otherwise, or just completely turns them around from where they're going. And they've done some really interesting studies on this out in Europe, looking at mortality as a function of how many cars are driving by. And so there's a lot going on in this graph. The bottom is how many vehicles in 24 hours. And going up and down is the probability of getting killed. So this line right here is 5 cars a minute. And right up here, this blue line is toads, and this yellow line are these frogs. So at 5 cars a minute, you're still having an 80% plus chance of being hit. 5 cars a minute is not that much compared to a lot of our major roads. On the other hand, hares, like rabbits, are down here in pink. And because they're so much more agile, they're able to move, they're larger, people can dodge them easier. Road crossings are not nearly as devastating to their populations. And there's been some neat work done in Vermont on how to minimize these. One are installing road crossings. They cost a lot of money to retrofit into roads. So I'm hoping that we'll start implementing it more when we're building roads. But this is a really neat video from Moncton that shows 1 hour of amphibian migration under the road in one of these wildlife corridors. So all these things moving are all like the frogs and salamanders. They've gotten raccoons and all types of animals going under it. And so if you imagine 5 cars a minute killing 80% of some of these species, absolutely destroys a population. And we've seen that happen quite a bit as we've had more roads being built in the state. I'll do a quick background of some of the species now that we see in the pools. We really have 4 vernal pool specialists as we think of them. 1 frog and 3 salamanders. The frog we focus on the most for vernal pools is the wood frog. It is a statewide species. This is probably the most common vernal pool amphibian. You'll see them breeding in roadside ditches and old skidder and ATV tracks. So they are very prolific breeders. They have very prominent dorsolateral ridges, which are these ridges right along the back. Compare that to a spring peeper. They don't have ridges along the back like that. And then they also have a cute little like robber mask on the front of their face. And as their name kind of implies, wood frogs, they spend most of their life in the woods. They only come to vernal pools briefly to breed. And when they do breed, they lay these massive egg masses of up to 1,000 embryos. They come up to these vernal pools, they lay their eggs, and then they bounce, they're out. So again, why it's so important to have no predators in these pools, because the wood frogs aren't defending their eggs. But they do have a really neat way of trying to maximize their reproductive input or output, and that is being the first individuals to the pool. They lay these eggs, each egg mass is 1 female, and so these are hundreds of individuals laying their eggs all in one large raft. And if you're the first individual to this site and you get your egg mass here in the middle, that's several degrees warmer than the egg masses out on the edges. And so because these species breed so early in the year, the pools might refreeze. And so if you're the earliest arrival to the pool and your eggs are right in the middle, they'll be several degrees warmer. They won't be as subject to frostbite and exposure to the cold, and also just predation. They're not going to be as exposed either. So earlier when I mentioned that they overwinter directly under the surface, even where they freeze solid in the winter, it's because that gives them a huge advantage when it comes to laying their eggs. The spotted salamander is also probably probably the most well-known vernal pool species, maybe one of the best known amphibians, just from the look of them. They're huge, up to 9 inches long, live 20 plus years. I mean, just look at that face. I love these things so much. And they're another statewide species. As far as our salamanders go, far and away the most common one. Their eggs have slightly less embryos than wood frogs, so up to 250, but they can also lay up to 3 egg masses per season. So they do, unlike the wood frogs, which only do 1 a year. I'll show you a comparison between wood frogs and salamanders in a second. But the main thing to recognize with these spotted salamanders is the outer jelly layer. When you look at wood frogs, you can see each embryo like a bump. There's no outer layer embryos. But with these spotted salamanders, you have the embryo, and then you have a solid centimeter of jelly on the outside. And you can also see it here a little bit. These are 2 different eggs of different development. This white one is also spotted salamander. It's just a phenotype based on a protein that some species or some individuals have. And in these 2, you can see there's a really dense outer layer of jelly surrounding the embryos. Again, in contrast to the to the wood frog. So this illustration from northern woodlands really shows that well. So wood frog on the left, see each individual embryo, no outer jelly envelope. Spotted salamander, a very prominent jelly envelope. Jefferson salamander is another vernal pool species. They seem really sensitive to so if you look at their range, it overlaps very closely with where we have calcium rich rock, because calcium rich rock helps buffer acidity and increase the pH of the vernal pools. And so we see them a lot on ridge tops, mountains, some of the ridge tops along the Connecticut River, and of course along Champlain. Not as much lowlands, but definitely like more ridge top. They are also very early migrants, kind of up there with wood frogs. They're earlier migrants than spotted salamanders are. Their egg masses, smaller than spotted salamanders, 5-ish to 35-ish embryos. And the main thing with these is that there still is that outer jelly layer, but it's really faint compared to the spotted salamanders, where there's more of a robust visible layer. Jefferson salamanders are almost invisible. And then the main ID between spotted salamanders and Jefferson salamanders and blue spotted salamanders, which I'm about to touch on, is the vitelline membrane. The vitelline membrane is that white halo that surrounds the dark embryo. And spotted salamanders have a really, really thick one, about as thick as the embryo. And we can see that over in this image, where you have the dark embryo and then the white vitelline membrane on the outside. Jefferson salamanders have a really, really small vitelline membrane compared to the embryo size. So that's really the key that I look for that kind of helps me determine what am I looking at. And then on top of that, wood frogs don't have any visible vitelline membrane. So if you see an egg mass where there's no outer jelly and there's no vitelline membrane and it's in a vernal pool, you're almost certainly looking at a wood frog egg mass. If you see a really large, robust jelly outer matrix with a large vitelline membrane, you're looking at a spotted salamander. Jefferson's very slight, somewhat delicate, small vitelline membrane, less embryos. And then the fourth vernal pool amphibian we really deal with is the blue spotted salamander, which is a really close relative to the Jefferson salamander. And these are, in contrast to the Jeffersons, which I described as a ridgetop species, these are a bit more of like a lowland species, lower elevation marshes. Not up here in the Connecticut River Valley as much, not along those ridges there, but Champlain lowlands, down in Brattleboro, and then some other isolated areas across the state. And these have the smallest egg masses of any of the species. Between 1 and 5 egg embryos per mass. So really small, really hard to see. And they also lay them on leaf litter and on twigs, which again makes them even harder to see. So these are probably undersurveyed compared to some of the other species. And similarly to the Jefferson salamander, these two have that really thin vitelline membrane. Both blue spotted and Jefferson salamanders also have much more liquidy of a jelly matrix to them. So this is a spotted salamander on the left out of the water. Sorry. And it's still holding its shape somewhat. This is Jefferson salamander on the right, and you can just see how it is almost, I wouldn't do this for more than 1 second because all the egg masses would probably fall off the stick. So a lot more liquidy than the spotteds. I mentioned that the spotteds and blue spotteds were really close cousins. They actually have a very interesting species complex called the unisex complex. And basically what happened is, hundreds of thousands of years ago, there was a hybridization event between between 2 of 5 species. And what came of it was an all-female lineage of salamanders that could accept reproductive material from any of 5 species. And so a lot of our sites in Vermont have some of this all-female lineage where they can take reproductive material from either a blue spotted and Jefferson or Jefferson salamander. They might have 2 sets of chromosomes. They might be tetraploid, they might be polyploid and have 3 or 4 sets of chromosomes. And then they can sub out parts of their DNA with the mate that they've selected. But the sex chromosome is never changed. So it's an all-female unisex lineage that can accept reproductive material from Jefferson, blue spotted, and 3 other species that we don't have in the state. And just extremely interesting. The ones I've seen mostly have, I think, had more Jefferson DNA in them, and so look a bit more Jefferson salamander-esque. But I think that's more biased by where I've been surveying for them. I think if you're in a lower elevation area where you have a lot of blue spotted salamanders, the blue spotted salamander DNA might succeed, and you'd have more blue spotted salamander like egg masses. The key for kind of spotting these guys is these pearly white non-viable embryos. Those can occur in all the species, especially if they're exposed to the cold. But if you see a lot of these egg masses with these pearly white, perfect photo, with these pearly white embryos that take up entire egg masses, this is kind of what a classic hybrid population would look like. Compared to on the top, where you have very few of these non-viable embryos, on the bottom you have half non-viable. And then I'll just mention one way this is how the salamanders breed. And if you see these in the pool, it can be an indication that, there was a lot of breeding activity sometime in, the past week or two. The males deposit these little packages called spermatophores on the pool floor, and then the females come and pick them up. And you can see these left over a lot if you go out the day or sometime in the week after the salamanders bred. And this is just a good signal that there was something happening at some point here. Eggs just might not have been laid yet. Now I'm going to touch on 3 vertebrates that we see a lot in vernal pools. One, which is got to be one of my favorite animals ever, are fairy shrimp. These are exceedingly rare in the state. We know them from 20 vernal pools maybe in the state. And each of those vernal pools is less than 1 acre. There isn't much habitat for them that we know of. There's probably more that we just haven't discovered, but they are exceedingly rare. We have 2 species that we know of in the state. I'm hoping to find a third in the southern part of the state this year. And their entire life cycle is based in vernal pools. They hatch shortly after ice is melted. They breed and they release their eggs, and then they die before the pool dries. And then their eggs, which are technically called cysts, are kind of like brine shrimp or like sea monkeys, where you can have them dried out for decades, and when they're exposed to water, they'll rehydrate. And so they'll be dried up in the vernal pools. We think that they need some type of exposure to cold to kind of activate the cyst. And so when the pool dries out, it might be like, cold snap, activate the cysts, the pool floods, and then they hatch. But we still really don't know much about their ecology in the state. Here's a little video on the left that I'll show that of them swimming. They're really graceful. People confuse them with mosquito larvae a lot, but in the video you'll see that they are fairly different in how they swim. So the fairy shrimp are the orange guys, and you can see like the pulsating appendages. Sorry, the name spacing is escaped me at the moment, but they pulsate these to move, whereas these brown mosquito larvae kind of flick their body. So the fairy shrimp actually swim. The mosquito larvae just kind of squirm around. The map on the right is the locations where we've sampled and ID'd the species from. So the red species is the knob-lipped fairy shrimp, and that's much more widespread. The blue is the smooth-lipped fairy shrimp. Seems much more range restricted to like the upper valley, maybe like the I-89 corridor. So we still have more sampling to do to try and fully understand the distribution of them, but we've been working with some partners to like truly understand and hopefully make sure we're conserving these vernal pools where they're found, because their area of occupancy being half an acre at most is so small. Another species we look for are caddisfly larvae. So the top photo here is an adult caddisfly. Kind of looks like a moth almost, but as they are aquatic, they lay their eggs in the water. They hatch soon after the ice melts, and then they build cases out of the materials that's found in the pool. So a lot of times you'll see them building cases out of shredded up leaves, needles, stones. They exist in streams where they build cases completely out of stones. People have done jewelry where you put some gold leaf in a dish with a juvenile caddisfly, and it'll build a case out of the gold leaf, and you can make earrings out of it. So they're really neat species, and they're really important as a sentinel species. So they're pretty sensitive to changes in water quality. And so by looking at these species, not just in vernal pools, but people also look at them in streams and in larger bodies of water, we can to some extent track the pollution and other changes that might be occurring in the chemistry of vernal pools. And then the final species I'm going to really drill in on are clams. These are more common than fairy shrimp. About 20 are mapped pools. But the really neat thing with these guys is that they're there year round. They are clams that live in the vernal pool. So they'll come out when the pool floods. But even when the pool dries, if you dig down in the leaf litter, you can find them. Because they can't go anywhere. The pool dries and they're just down trying to stay wet in the leaf litter. And so they're really nice. If you think you might have a vernal pool, you have an area that looks like it might be, seasonally inundated with water, you can look in the leaf litter and see if you can find fairy shrimp. And if you do, that's a really good indicator that it is a vernal pool, or at least it has some type of hydrology in the water. The water floods it every so often. So that's the basic overview of the species that we really care about. The species that are, for the most part, specialists to vernal pools, or have species that are specialists to vernal pools. Now I want to talk a little bit about the actual conservation and management of these sites. Conservation for vernal pools breaks into two things. One is conserving the vernal pool itself, where the breeding activity happens, and the other is ensuring that the non-breeding habitat's also protected, because these amphibians don't disperse far. And so to make sure that where they are dispersing to, the area directly around the vernal pool, is conserved and able to allow them to survive between breeding seasons. I'll start with the basin conservation itself. Like when we think of a vernal pool, what we think of the vernal pool is where it floods. That's the basin. The first thing is, if you're doing forestry activity, you don't want heavy machinery in the basin. That can compact soils. It can open up ruts. It can change the hydrology of the sites. And so you don't want to have machinery in the basin of the pool itself. Two is, you don't want to minimize disturbances uphill of the pool basin. So if you have roads or log landings uphill, that could really increase the sediments that are picked up by water when they go down toward the pool, which can in turn be damaging to the amphibians and invertebrates that stay there. So trying to minimize the uphill disturbances from the pool. You don't want to take trees from the pool. Pools are protected from development, but there's actually no protection from activity for vernal pools. But you don't want to take pools from the depression, because that will just expose lots of soil. Will reduce the shade in the pool. So even though you can remove trees from vernal pools, you really should avoid it. And finally, you don't want to leave additional woody debris in pools. Pools have the structure they do naturally for the most part, and you don't want to mess with all the vegetation structure by adding in tons of recently cut branching. That could also release tannins and other chemicals from the recently deceased trees, wetwood, into the pools that might not have otherwise been there. So you don't want to mess with the type of structure that's existing in the vernal pool for the most part. When we're thinking about non-breeding habitat conservation, we really just want to maintain a healthy upland environment. One of the biggest things for that is maintaining a floor that can hold moisture. Again, as I said, there's no limits to the silviculture and logging activities surrounding vernal pools. So you could, in theory, clear cut. But if you clear cut and there's no moisture held on the forest floor, it's going to be really hard for these amphibians that require moisture to survive to migrate successfully. Even if it's a really rainy night, if the water's not being maintained in the leaf litter and in the soil because there's no shade, that's just not going to end well for the amphibs. Kind of going off of that too, you want to try and keep harvesting. If you are going to take wood from the forest. Uniform, so you don't want to have big patches of exposed forest floor in some areas and other areas untouched. You want to try and keep it somewhat uniform, and with that, you want to, again, keep it light so you're not just clear cutting the entire area around the pool. Another big one that I think a lot of foresters already do is to harvest on frozen ground. A lot of people might do this so that they're not getting their skidders and equipment, stuck in 3 feet of mud during mud season. But also, if you're only doing it on frozen ground, you're not going to create massive ruts. You're not going to have tons of mineral soil exposed that could run off into the basin. And the roads that are created just won't be as damaging in the long term. And then again, kind of going off of that, avoiding the bare soil and ruts that could both cause mineral soil to be caught up and flow downstream, but also with ruts, you could lure amphibians to breeding in ruts from machinery, and wood frogs especially can be tricked into breeding in areas that might only hold water for a couple weeks. And so if you have ruts all over the forest, you might have tons of amphibians trying to breed in these pools and having zero success and creating these population sinks compared to if they were all going to the vernal pool where it holds water all year long, where you have a source population that's having amphibians that are dispersing to the landscape. I saw, someone mentioned the buffer, and you're totally right. We do have these management zones around vernal pools that we suggest basically the amount of canopy that should be left. So the immediate 100 feet around the pool is the most important area. You have the depression, and you have the area where almost every amphibian that breeds there will have to journey through at some point. Oh, sorry, the depression, then you have the protection zone, which is that 100 feet around the pool. And you have the amphibian, what's known as the life zone. And we've done a ton of research looking at how far amphibians disperse between breeding seasons. And in general, once an amphibian or a vernal pool amphibian begins breeding, it returns to the same site every year. And so it's not dispersing far across the landscape. I'm not sure if you've ever seen a salamander walk, but they're not good at walking. They're built for digging and being in the water. And so they're not going too far. So almost their entire adult life is spent within this 500-foot buffer from the vernal pools. And so if you can really focus on conserving this 500-foot area, you're going to be doing really well conserving the majority of that breeding population. That's really one of the exciting things about vernal pool conservation is we are facing so many massive scale, comprehensible issues conservation. But vernal pools are something where one landowner could conserve an entire population just within the 500 feet of the pool because of how local they stay. And so it really is exciting for local conservation opportunities that we can directly impact and see the direct results of in our own backyards and in our communities. I went back. We have this loaded online on our website, and it's just kind of the basic diagram of what type of forestry activity and like take from the forest you want to do surrounding the basin. So in the vernal pool basin, of course, zero activity in the basin. This one up here is like the before image where it shows about a 95% canopy cover surrounding the basin, and down below is the post management forest, where within that 100-foot buffer, you maintain 75% canopy cover. And within that amphibian life zone, you have about 55% cover. I think someone might have mentioned in the chat that ideally that 100-foot buffer has no management. 100% true. Ideally, there is no management surrounding the vernal pool, but I also understand that management is needed especially in the face of things like beach leaf disease and some of the other forestry diseases we're seeing. And so the main message to get across is that around the basin, you want to maintain a high level of canopy cover. Within 400, 500 feet of the basin, you want to maintain relatively uniform canopy cover. And once you're away from there, the canopy cover is a little bit less of an issue as far as the vernal pool amphibians go. On like a more of a landscape scale, this is kind of what it actually looks like. So you have 3 vernal pools, these 3 blue dots. You have the 100-foot buffer, the area where you really want to minimize management, the yellow zone, and then the red zone is that, again, 600 foot is what it says here, 400 to 600 feet, depending on your source, is kind of going to say the recommendation. I say around 500 feet just to average it out. And so this pool here to the far left, that looks great. You know, there's not been any major forestry activity that's leaving big clear cuts. This one here right in the middle, it's okay. You know, you're verging on some overtake in that life zone. And then this third one here, about half of its life zone is uninhabitable to amphibians. And so forget about, you know, population dynamics and stuff. Just inherently, half of this pool's population is probably gone, or it's going to never reach the full capacity that it could had this not been cut so heavily. And this is going to lead me in a bit to the need to know where vernal pools are. Vernal pools are short term, only around for a couple of months a year. They're small and highly localized. So unless you're looking for them in the exact right spot, you probably won't see them. And if you're doing, you know, you're doing forestry in the winter, the pool might not even be visible by the time you're out in the field, right? And so part of our vernal pool work, in addition to forming these recommendations and stuff, has just been identifying where these pools are, because you can't conserve them if you don't know where they are. And this is just an example of a site where, using satellite images, you can see this dark area here on the screen. And that's, like, from satellite images, a classic vernal pool signature. When you have imagery, especially when it's done during the winter and fall, when there's no leaves on the trees, you can see this deciduous tree area. You know, the conifers still have their needles, so they're red. And then you can see the standing water or the shadow of the depression from the vernal pool where there's no leaves. You know, so this was 1991 when these photos were taken. And now if you fast forward to 2016, house there. And you know, there's the argument that could be made that they didn't know a vernal pool was there. An argument could be made that they ignored a vernal pool and filled it over. But there's nothing we can do about it now, because there's just, it wasn't mapped. We had no proof a pool was there. We had no documentation of amphibians using it. And so it was lost. Inherently, all vernal pools have legal protections in Vermont. We're really fortunate in that way, where all of our vernal pools are protected under Act 250 and 248. But it requires us to map them beforehand. And so as we're winding down this presentation, I just want to mention that we have a really neat project online called the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, where we have used satellite images, data sets from the Vermont Herp Atlas, some local conservation commissions, the state, and we've compiled all these potential vernal pool sites to a map. So all the yellow orange dots are sites that were remotely sensed, and we need someone to go to the ground and actually verify if it's a vernal pool or not. And all these blue ones, the darker blue ones, have been visited and are confirmed, and as such have been added to the Vermont Agency for Natural Resource Planning Atlas, so that in the future, you know, we'll be like, oh, we have proof a vernal pool was there and you built over it. And so I'm not sure, was it 717? I'll load up the atlas real quick and just give a quick 100 feet in the sky overview. But it'd be, I think, really cool if people were interested in seeing where their vernal pools potentially mapped on their land or in their local communities. Maybe you know a landowner, maybe it's a local town forest. You could go out with a data sheet, fairly simple, document the vernal pool and submit it to the atlas. And doing so will make sure it's on these agency planning documents that people go through when they're going through permitting processes and when people are, going through land transfers. So I'll pull the atlas up real quickly, and then maybe we'll do questions, comments, concerns from there. So let me share my screen once more. So I think Dana might just put it in the chat, but this is vpatlas.org, the Vermont Vernal Pool Atlas, and we do at some point hope to expand to some other states as well, other New England states particularly. And at the top here, it says View Pools. And if you click View Pools on the top, it will load up the map. And from here, you can zoom in. I'll go to the Norwich area near our offices. All these orange dots are sites that were remotely sensed and need to be confirmed. We don't know if it is a site or not. And anyone can go out and do that. Vernal pools are so exciting because it is such a small scale thing. There's only 4 species you really have to learn, that it's possible for pretty much anyone to go out and do some of this field confirmation, especially if you're the landowner. And so I think we have some stuff that Dana linked online, but in your free time, I would suggest looking around at this. If you're on a conservation commission or something, this could be a great local project that we could partner with you on, help train you up to ID the egg masses, and then you could, maybe for a 1-year project, just try and map as many of these vernal pools as possible. Some towns, such as Dummerston, have done town-wide inventories, and then they've given us that data to incorporate into the atlas. And so any support with documenting these vernal pools will go a long way, especially when we start seeing more and more land transfers, and more changes to the landscape and land parcelization, developments going in for housing. This is kind of the number one way to protect vernal pools, is to identify them so we have proof of where they are. I think that puts us at what, 7:20. I guess I'll stop rambling a bit and open it up to questions. But I hope you learned a bit about the amphibians we have and why these little tiny pockets of water in the middle of our giant forests are so important. And I hope that if you're interested in learning more, you'll reach out to Dana and myself, and we'd be happy to talk more about getting your pools mapped and protected.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin. That's great. I pinned up Dana, and Kevin and myself will have a little conversation. Please type your questions in the chat box. I'm going to point out a few things that I learned, which I thought was really exciting. And one was, the broad-winged hawks were really tied to sort of the ice out and coming back and the opening up of those vernal pools. I love broad-winged hawks, and I had never really put those 2 facts together. So thank you.
Yeah, they seem to be I can't take credit. I saw it on one other vernal pool books about amphibian connoisseurs. So they're very, very well known around vernal pools.
I mean, it makes sense as a forested hawk, right? One that lives and breeds in the forested area, that would be an area that they would hunt. But I just really never thought about it. So cool.
Yeah.
The other thing was the caddisfly jewelry. I think that was really cool. I want to go check out. Dana put something in the chat on a website to go to, so I'm gonna go check that out after we get off. That's very cool.
Really
and the other thing that I want to share while we have everybody still on before people start jumping off, is that we have some in-person vernal pool visits coming up. So if you enjoyed the talk tonight and you want to go out and see some of these things with these experts, we've got 3 walks that'll be coming up. The first is April 19th in North Bennington on Coverts Cooperators land, Solon Road, and Dana will be there looking at his vernal pools, and it's going to be really exciting, a lot of fun. That one's coming up. The next one after that is May 3rd. That's going to be in Williamstown at Cooperator Rich and Ann Chalmers land. And they have a series of vernal pools, and theirs are enrolled in an ESTA. And if you don't know what an ESTA is, it's an incentive for you to go to the walk and learn what an ESTA is. And that one's taking place on May 3rd. And then the last one is going to be May 10th. And that's going to be at Matzinger Forest up in Danville. It's a forest owned by the Fairbanks Museum. And Kevin's going to be leading that one. So if you want to head out in the field with Kevin, that would be a great one to go to. And that's, again, May 10th. And to sign up for any of those, you can visit our website and go to our calendar page on those dates. You can also sign up for our e-news if you don't already get it. The links to register for those will be in there. And if you can't find that, you can certainly email me. I'll put my email in the chat and let me know and we'll get you signed up. Any questions in the chat, Dana?
Yeah, so Brent had a question about what size of pool should be reported? Is there any sort of minimum size of a vernal pool that we are looking for?
No minimum size. It's more, does it hold water all year round? Because usually a small pool might not hold enough water to successfully, have time to metamorph. So it's not much of a size. If it holds water and it's 3 feet by 3 feet and the amphibians breed there, it's, in my mind, at least from wildlife, as far as wildlife are concerned, it's a vernal pool. So I wouldn't say there's minimum size.
We had another question that I'm gonna have to find. Do you know if caddisflies are more reactive to temperature versus chemistry, like acidity?
I think it's mostly pollutants. They seem fairly temperature stable. I guess I'll also say though that caddisfly, there's a lot of species of caddisfly, some that are specialized in cool mountain streams, some that are found in vernal pools, some that are found in bad mud puddles. So I think it'll probably be species dependent, but from how we think of it, it's much more water quality pollutant type stuff.
Cool. There's also a question about creating.
Go ahead, Dana.
Oh, sorry. There's also a question about creating vernal pools on your property. I linked an older Northern Woodlands article that's actually from Solon Road. He wrote it. But
Great.
if you have any other suggestions.
I have not had much experience with it. It takes a lot of work. I think sometimes people think, oh, I'll dig a pit and it will flood and become a vernal pool. And there's much more to it than that. So I just say make sure you're doing research and looking up on it. But I think it's totally possible. And there's been studies that have shown human-made vernal pools can be more productive than natural ones. It's just making sure that the basin and soils will hold water, which not everywhere in the middle of a forest will. Yes, and as Zapata said, do not dig existing wetlands to create a vernal pool basin. Do not do that.
Yeah, we've had a couple cooperators down in Bennington County that have done some created some vernal pools that have been very successful on their land. So it does work. It's better to protect the ones that are here, that are in existence. The animals are already keyed into it, attracted to it, breeding near it, and so those are the most important. Kevin, let me ask you a question. Is you're working with the volunteers and you're asking them to go look at these vernal pools. As you said, many are on private land. Should they ask permission? How should they go about it if they want to look at these?
Yeah, so a pool cannot be officially confirmed and added to the atlas without added to the A&R atlas without full landowner permission. Without landowner permission, we can still add it as a potential site to the vernal pool atlas. It just can't be fully confirmed and get all those legal protections necessarily. Well, it does, but it'd be just hard to protect it long term. You can, in Vermont, you can go on private land that's not posted in theory to look at vernal pools, but it's best to get landowner permission to do so. And again, without landowner permission, the field won't be fully confirmed. The pool won't be fully confirmed. So I'd say ideally you have the landowner permission, but I also know that I've seen vernal pools on land abutting town forests just to go look at them because you're allowed to. So say I don't want to get in trouble legality wise, but yeah, like obviously don't trespass.
Let me point out too, the thing I found very interesting also was the squishing rate, a car every 5 minutes. Our book group for Vermont Coverts Red Crossings by Ben Goldfarb, which also features our Moncton underpass. And it was fascinating to read all of the situations where wildlife, it's considered a moving fence is the way they described it, which I thought was fascinating. And one of the recommendations is, if we drive the speed limit, we really would be making a difference. I mean, this time of year, you can see so many carcasses of various wildlife on the side of the road. And so we can all do something by driving less, driving the speed limit, because you have better reaction times on those roads.
Yeah, totally. And I'll say that North Branch Nature Center has an amphibian road crossing monitoring program that I've done a bit of, and that can be great on the local level. If you can be like, hey, I have evidence where 90% of our amphibians are being hit. Maybe once a spring for the best migration night, we can close the road down because it's a back road and there's 3 alternate ways you can take. So there's also a ton of stuff like that you can do on the local level to help protect the populations, where it's just like, let's just close off this one road for one rainy night every April, to help at least the bulk of them get across in that one, prime migration night.
That's great. Well, there are a lot of things that, I heard tonight that landowners can do to help with vernal pools in terms of the management of the vernal pools, in terms of crossing amphibians, of protecting those in terms of water quality, identifying them within your town, using Conservation Commission as a project. I think that was a great idea. We have a lot of coverts cooperators that on their Conservation Commission, so there's an idea for you. Well, so we're approaching 7:30. I do like to give people their evening. If there's any last minute questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box. Kevin, Dana, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to our field trips. And hopefully people will be signing up after tonight. They're going to be excited. And again, thank you all for joining us tonight for our vernal pool talk.
Yeah, thank you. I look forward to it too. I saw one last question roll in about the presence of amphibians indicating vernal pools. I mean, in theory, kind of, but it could be, a vernal pool was there 10 years ago and it's the last ones. It could be 1 year it flooded a roadside ditch and they were able to breed, but the rest of the years the roadside ditch dries up too soon. So I think I'd like to say that it is a signal there's a vernal pool somewhere, but it's definitely not a hard, fast rule.
All right.
But yeah, I hope some people do sign up, and we'd love to see you out there.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you so much.